Since 1934, Iowa's farmers have turned to the Iowa Farm Bureau spokesman as their trusted news source. Now, the Spokesman Speaks. Listen in and hear from leading experts on topics important to farmers and agriculture. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to this special November 12th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today is our second part of a three-part series with three Midwestern Farm Bureau economists: Iowa Farm Bureau Senior Economist Dr. Sam Funk, Nebraska Farm Bureau Senior Economist Jay Rempe, and Illinois Farm Bureau Senior Economist Mike Doherty. Our three economists got together for a virtual meeting in late October to discuss the important economic insights for their respective states in 2020, as well as their predictions looking ahead further out into the future. We recorded the audio from that meeting and split it into three parts. We released part 1 on November 9th. We're giving you part 2 today, and part 3 will be released on November 16th. If you subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks in your favorite podcast app, you'll be able to catch all three episodes. In part 1, our economists talked about farm income conditions in each of their respective states, farm credit conditions, government assistance, the international trade environment, and much more. Today, in part 2, they'll get into topics like the changing nature of farm production, farm ownership, and farm management in Iowa, Nebraska, and Illinois, along with other topics like the impact of COVID-19. So let's get down to it. Spokesman editor Dirk Steimel is moderating the discussion.
Mike, how has the state commodity mix and operating environment changed in Illinois over the years? And do you expect that to keep changing?
Actually, it has not changed very much. It's been amazingly stable. If you look at the 2017 and 2012 Census of Ag, you'll find the same percentage of total revenues on farms are derived from corn, soybeans, and a bit of wheat as they were 10 years ago. And the livestock side, which is about 20% of our farm revenues, that has stayed the same. We did have a drop down. You go back 15, 20 years and look at the Census of Ag, we had a decrease in that livestock income. And so we used to have a little bit more livestock income. But in terms of the structure, the other aspect of structure is to talk about farm ownership, right? And how large the farms are and things like that. And what we've seen has really been a very slow rate of change in consolidation of farms. And I'm not sure, there's people out there who will say that we're in for a wave with these low corn and soybean prices if they come about, not the current ones, but come about next year in 2021. And we have a lack of ad hoc payments will create this wave of consolidation. I'm not so sure, because this seems like we've had I guess I'll call it a shadow type of consolidation going on over the last 10 years in Illinois of a new model for farm ownership. The business itself is a multi-generation ownership and management with 2 or 3 different families involved. Sometimes many as 10 different people having some degree of management responsibility over that farm. And with these farms sometimes spread out over 2 or 3 counties. So even though they are still a family farm, and I'm not saying this is true for all farms. We have a lot of farms that are exactly the same sort of structure they were 10 years ago. But as far as the edge that's changing on these large farms, that's what we're seeing is kind of a joining together of various family members, still oftentimes almost always related to each other, and taking on different roles on these much larger and more complex farms in terms of the marketing. So I think that's a trend that might just continue, and we might not have some big wave of consolidation.
Sam, do you see the same in Iowa?
I think that if we look at where we're producing and what we're producing, obviously Iowa is tremendously productive when we think about corn and soybean, those primary row crops. Cattle production and hog production face their own challenges. As sometimes even with crops, you get your conservation issues. you get some of those other challenges that come forward. But I'm with Mike as far as for some of the changes that we see in agriculture. I think one of the strong points about Iowa agriculture is the attractiveness for the rural lifestyle across the state, and the ability still to have people who are going to be engaged in production agriculture and might be looking for off-farm employment even. And we see those metro centers and the university towns and those areas providing great levels of employment in the state, and that's part of the reason that we've seen this very gradual increase still yet in the population for the state, but it's not uniform across the state. Some of our rural counties actually have a population decline, while we've seen large growth in some of those areas just on the edge of some of the metro areas. So it's important that we think about exactly what opportunities are going to be available to farmers across the state. I mean, what's going to happen with high-speed internet access? I think that's always one that comes up into several areas, whether we're talking about, coronavirus and some of the impacts on employment levels, or if we're talking about just in general for, quality of life and being able to have telemedicine and other factors, and, being able to participate in precision agriculture aspects, whether it be in the field or, being able to access some of the markets that you need to have that high-speed internet available to you to participate in all sorts of rigorous aspects on the farm or in an off-farm related employment. So I think as we look at some of those numbers, I mean, it's also possible that by 2030, and we've done this projection before, we might actually have fewer and consistently fewer than 10,000 farms in the state of Iowa who are producing 85% of the production as far as for a dollar value from the state, which it's significant when you start to think about some of that level, and frankly, the change in efficiency, and where producers are able to farm more ground themselves. Maybe they're looking to bring in, seasonal help. Maybe they're just, they've got the equipment and the capability to handle more ground themselves also. So it's a lot of changes that are coming in agriculture. There's a lot of technology shifts out through here. And at the same time, there's going to be a lot of farms that are going to find new ways to adapt and to continue to thrive in that system. But kind of going back to that tale of two farms that Jay mentioned, there are going to be challenges in that changing farm landscape too.
Jay, do you see the same thing in Nebraska?
Yeah, I really do. It hasn't changed much. We're still pretty much a corn, soybean, and beef dominated state. I have seen a little bit of, it's kind of interesting in the last few years, a bit of a renaissance, if you will, in some of the other livestock sectors in the state of Nebraska. We were fortunate to have a Costco project come in and locate in Fremont. It's a poultry processing facility, and they're manufacturing or processing a certain bird with certain specifics that they want for that bird. And because of that, we're seeing a growth of poultry barns in the eastern side of the state within 150 miles of that project. At the same time, near Grand Island, which is about halfway central to part of the state of Nebraska, we've got a egg laying operation that are going up there. And so we're seeing some different changes in growth. We had a change in law a couple of years ago to allow packer ownership of hogs. We had a prohibition against that until about 4 or 5 years ago. So we're seeing some more contracting in the hog industry right now here in the state of Nebraska. So it's been kind of satisfying to see that diversification, if you will. And oftentimes these are crop farmers that are taking on these additional enterprises as a way to diversify and maybe generate some more value added to their operation. So I think that's been good to see. Nebraska is a little unique in that on the eastern side of the state, we're probably a lot like Iowa and Illinois in terms of our rainfall and topography and the soil capabilities and the like. But you don't have to get too far west and it changes dramatically. And by the time you hit the western part of the state, we're pretty dry and arid, and it's tough to raise a crop out there. So they've got a lot of different cropping mixes already in the Panhandle with sugar beets and dry beans and edible peas and those millet and those kind of things. And we're seeing to some extent, because of the plant plant-based proteins that are being come on the market. We're seeing a little bit of growth in that segment, I think, out in western Nebraska, that are fulfilling those needs for plant-based proteins to help in that. So obviously, we're watching that issue very closely because of our animal protein segment in the state, but it's having a bit of a positive impact there in the western part of the state in terms of the cropping mix too.
You know, Jay, you mentioned some really good points out there with some of the similarities that our states enjoy. And that's part of the reason about getting together with, 3 Midwestern State Farm Bureau economists. If you think about Western Iowa and Eastern Nebraska, we're kind of a little codependent out through there. We appreciate having Omaha available for a lot of off-farm employment, and I know a lot of people who drive across that river every day, and I know a lot of farmers who tend to take corn to both sides of that river, whether it's for export markets or for ethanol markets. And so you mentioned about that poultry processing facility that went into Nebraska. Thank you very much. We have a lot of Iowa producers who are raising birds to go into that facility as well. And that's been something that, we've had a lot of our young farmers engaged in raising birds to go in through there. And so it has been a difference maker for a lot of people to think about where those new facilities locate and what opportunities they present for a young or beginning farm family to be able to diversify, to have another income stream, if you will, that if it's something that can help them to be able to grow and to provide for that family living, that's a very important aspect. And Mike and I have had these discussions throughout the years as well. I mean, obviously, when we start talking about the eastern side of Iowa and that western side of Illinois, there's a lot of similarities there. And obviously that export marketplace and where that grain is going to flow, it's a very important aspect for thinking about just how things are shaping up and changing out through there. So that again shows you just how interconnected a lot of our states are for the economic activity in general, but then specifically for the agricultural economic activity.
Certainly, COVID has been the big story so far in 2020. Mike, has COVID had a long-term effect on agriculture there in Illinois?
Not yet, or not so much. It did through the markets, obviously. So the way COVID affected Illinois, and I think it's going to be the same across the Corn Belt, was how much it reduced driving, which reduced gasoline consumption, reduced ethanol, and that weakened our corn prices considerably. The other one on the COVID impact was how it disrupted the meat processing sector. So for a while, we had extremely low pork prices and beef prices, with that supply piling up, waiting to be able to be fed through a meat processing plant that was either shuttered or partly shut down, out of health concerns for the workers having COVID. So that was the way it affected us. Now that has turned around, and we've gotten to some extent, except our ethanol plants are still up and down the Corn Belt, and Jay and Sam can speak to this more probably than I can, because they've got a lot of ethanol out there on their side of the Corn Belt. But those ethanol plants are still producing about what I've heard is 10% less than they would have been at this time if it were not for COVID. So that's a weakness there on those prices. So now, the other thing I want to ask about, and I would love to hear the input from Sam and Jay on this question, is how much risk does COVID present to off-farm or non-farm income in some of these rural counties, and especially with our young farmers who 50%, at least here in Illinois, 50% of their household expenditure is covered by non-farm income. And we're having a big resurgence in COVID-19, and we have our governor has already announced some partial shutdowns or restrictions on business throughout Southern Illinois and in Northwestern Illinois. So we're keeping a close eye on that too.
That is a really good question to think about, that off-farm employment aspect for COVID. Specifically, let's focus in on that. Those age 35 and younger, we took a strong look at what was going on as far as for off-farm employment. More than 58% of our young farmers aged 35 and younger actually work 200 or more days off the farm. So it's important for a lot of producers exactly what kind of employment aspects are available. If you were to look at all the farmers across the state of Iowa on the most recent census of agriculture, which is 2017, you've got just right, you're sitting there, it's this bimodal distribution, if you will. You've got a significant portion who work 0 days off the farm, and then you've got about the same number who work 200 or more days off the farm. So a significant portion who depend on off-farm employment, whether it be for the benefits, whether it be for actual salary level to bring in to be able to provide for family living. At the end of the day, what a lot of people need to understand who aren't necessarily engaged in production agriculture all the time, farms are there to provide for somebody's economic living, right? They might be an employer base for a number of families and employees, or if it's just a sole proprietorship, it's there to provide for that individual or that family for that family living. And so it's very important. But some of these operations, frankly, when we become so efficient in agriculture that you can do more with fewer people, that they depend on off-farm employment to be able to weather through. Why were farmers able to be able to survive this period of low prices? A lot of them, it was because of the ability they had to still borrow against land. A lot of them, it's because they had the opportunity to go out and find off-farm employment to be able to supplement family living. And I think we should never forget the importance of that. And we talk about it here in Iowa a lot, which again comes back to the availability for high-speed internet on the farm, not just for precision agriculture, but also to be able to participate in that off-farm employment sector. So it is very important that we think about that. And so when COVID shuts down a lot of the economic activity, a lot of these producers weren't going to go into an office, they were going to work off the farm. If you don't have the access, like we have this technology here, and I can look straight into this computer, and if we had everybody available to look on this, we could do a webinar together and just be able to record it and be able to have these meetings. I've had more Teams meetings or GoTo meetings or Zoom meetings than I ever could imagine before. And it's not because we weren't doing something, it's because we were probably actually more active in doing things because we needed to have meetings to get information out through to a broader base to be able to share information. So if you don't have that high-speed internet out there, and if that office job isn't available to you because that office is closed down because of COVID, then you're really stuck not having that opportunity to participate in what's become more and more a virtual marketplace for off-farm employment.
All right, we hope that you learned something new there. With parts 1 and 2 in the books, we've already covered a lot of ground, and there's much more to come in part 3 of this 3-part series, including a discussion about farm demographics, the impact of consumer and farmland owner preferences on farming practices, how the next generation of farmers is changing things up, and much more. We'll release part 3 on November 16th. And again, you can catch that episode by subscribing to the Spokesman Speaks in your favorite podcast app. I also want to remind you that this 3-part podcast series is a precursor for an economic webinar series that Iowa Farm Bureau will be offering in 2021. If you listened to our last episode, you heard Dr. Sam Funk talk about that webinar series, and of course, we'll have much more for you on that as we get closer to 2021. With that, I'll wrap up this episode of the podcast. Thanks again to all of you for tuning in, including our neighbors from Nebraska and Illinois. Thank you for doing the work that strengthens agriculture across the Midwest and throughout the country, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.